Hello, welcome to those of you who are joining us. We'll be populating up this webinar. You see in front of you our wonderful guests for today. And thank you for being right on time. And we'll just give folks a couple more minutes to get their technology sorted as they're logging on. We're all getting more Zoom savvy, but there's still glitches to be had. So, yeah. Well, welcome. So for those of you who have joined us, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. I'll make another call for this along the way, but it's part of our goal of having this webinar series is to provide an opportunity for us to be getting together as a food systems community. We do keep track of the chat, so we save it. And share it with people afterwards, because there's a lot of great stuff that happens in there. So just be aware, but we'd love to have you introduce yourself to the rest of the community that will be joining us. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and formally get us started for today. I always like to start on time because I always feel there's such an urgency around food systems issues that there's no time to wait. So welcome everybody to the third episode of Food Systems Fridays. This webinar is organized by the Sustainable Food Systems faculty at Prescott College, and many of them has joined us today for the faculty. So my name is Robin Currey, and I'm the director of the Master of Science in Sustainable Food Systems program. We are an online program that really seeks to support students in their efforts to build a more sustainable food system in their own communities. College towns tend to collect a disproportionate number of academic activists, but our hometowns need folks paying attention to food systems also. So we work with our students and try to be in partnership with them so that they can take what they're learning in the classroom and apply it to improving their own food systems. And as always, call to teachers, please feel free to integrate us into your now online curriculum. So we're here every week for the foreseeable future, exactly at this same time. And the reason why we started this webinar is that we know that there are families that are encountering unique situations where they cannot find the kinds of foods they're used to in the amounts that they're used to. And the spotlight is on our food systems. The spotlight is on our food supply chains. And clearly our existing food systems, even in the best of time, are not equitably ensuring food for all. And they're really being put to the test in trying times. So for those of you who are less familiar, a food system encompasses all of the stages of keeping us nourished. This is growing, harvesting, packing, processing, transforming, marketing, consuming, and hopefully not too much disposing of food. We're avid advocates at Prescott College for sustainable diets. And these are diets with low environmental impacts, most often with local supply chains. And we know that they can play an important role in ensuring food and nutrition security. As a faculty, all of those that you see on the panel today, we are thinking about the increased vulnerability to food insecurity that has happened as a result of the isolation measures and other disruptions associated with the COVID-19 virus. This shows us more now than ever that we have important work to do, not just now in the short term with our restrictions in place, but in the longer term. What do we need to do to ensure safe, resilient food systems? We have to get it right. It's just too important. So the Food System Fridays series is really focusing on policies, practices, and people who can show us and help us learn about models of sustainable food systems and communities. Next week, we're going to be focusing on a community in school gardens in the time of COVID-19. Clearly, we have no students at the schools, and there are concerns, but also opportunities with community gardens. We know that they have an essential role in education and food security, and it is now time to plant. So we have two of the folks who are on the panel today, Dr. Wendy Sue Harper and Eleanor Tison, are going to be leading our episode for next week. So for today, many of you are now Zoom pros after a few more weeks of this, but for others of you, this may be the first time that you're in a Zoom webinar. And some of these features in the Zoom webinar are a little different from your basic Zoom. So I want to just let you know we are recording this. We want to make sure that this information is available, freely available through our websites for folks who aren't able to make it at this specific time. And also, so if you're participating in chat also, that means that you're agreeing to allow Prescott College to distribute this, capture and distribute your comments, which we hope you will contribute to comments, because a lot of you will have the answers to questions that will be coming up during the webinar. The recordings are freely available, as will the chat. So to get to the chat function, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen, for most of us, if it's not on the bottom, hover around the top, and it'll you'll see a little like bubble sign, like in the old school comic books. And so go ahead and click on that chat, and then you can just type. You'll see there's a little toggle button. You can send individual communications to individuals, or you can have it be to everyone, and that's preferred, so that we know what questions are coming up, and I will be keeping track of any questions through there. If you know the answer to specific questions that come up in the chat, please feel free to jump in there and chime in and just be part of the community. Please feel free to share whatever your comfort level is, but sharing your contact information, especially if you're representing an organization engaged in the food system, so that folks can easily follow up with you if they have questions for you. You can ask questions through the chat, but there's also a Q&A space that you can also access through that toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom page. I will be monitoring those spaces while the panel is underway. And also, if you encounter technical problems or have comments, and especially if you have questions for the speakers, and if you want to share resources, the chat is the place to do it. So it's a great community building space, so I encourage you to take the time now to please say hello and provide a brief introduction, and maybe say even why you registered for the webinar today. I think folks are curious. So now to the real reason why we're all here today. The actual webinar topic is, you know, as I mentioned before, we're really wanting to make sure that we're getting things right in the future in terms of food system sustainability. What the disruptions in the food systems recently have shown us is that we have some vulnerabilities. And so we want to take a moment and reflect on these points of vulnerability, but we've also found points of resiliency in our food system that have emerged in the past few weeks. And we also want to be paying attention to those so that we can build on them in efforts to transform food systems for the long term. So we all know that social distancing, reduced transportation, localized food shortages, especially our restaurant closures, and unemployment are all key challenges to our food system. The folks who are in the front line of food access, those who are operating and volunteering at our food banks, growing and selling at our farmers markets, working at our distribution centers, hunkered at computers and on the phone lobbying for additional policy support. They're super busy, and we thought the best way that we could support them this week is to leave them alone with their long to-do lists. And what we would do is focus on our faculty here in the Sustainable Food Systems program. They're located all over the country. We are an online program, and we wanted them to weigh in on how they see the dynamic scenario of food access during the COVID-19 era unfolding in their bioregions. So we're going to have snapshots from all across the country. We know that things are not unrolling and unraveling equally across the country. I mean, from Vermont, where one of our panelists is from, farmers markets, for example, were not immediately designated as an essential function. They were not allowed to operate as normal under the stay-home orders. But they did enact, for example, an appeal process where the farmers markets could outline their social distancing and large market crowd elimination protocols. Other places, for example, California, where others of our panelists are coming from, it was automatic. We know, so for example, Louisiana, I've been keeping track. There, for example, there's the Rosslyn Foundation and the Campty Field of Dreams organization, and they're working to pivot their programming to support beginning growers in high poverty communities as planting season starts. In North Carolina, they are temporarily increasing the supplemental nutrition benefits, and in other places they've extended double up food bucks policies. So there's all sorts of different things that are going on, but being implemented differently in different parts of the country. So that's why we are having our episode today, which is food access in COVID-19, what's happening in your bioregion. So I want to introduce our facilitator for this conversation, Sharon Palmer. So you will see her there on the screen. And Sharon Palmer has her Master's of Science in Sustainable Food Systems, and she's a registered dietitian, and she's known as the plant-powered dietitian. She teaches sustainable diets at Prescott College and is a food and nutrition journalist living in Ojai, California. She's authored 2 books on plant-based eating, with another one coming out this year. She's written more than 1,000 articles in a variety of publications, in addition to blogging every day at SharonPalmer.com. So I'll share some of that information with you in the chat so that you can learn more about the background of our panelists, but I'll hand it over to Sharon to introduce the rest of our guests today.
Thank you, Robin. I'm so happy to be here today, and I want to introduce the rest of our panel. So we have Barbara Gemmill-Herren here, and she has expertise in agroecology, biodiversity, and food systems transformations. She teaches food systems, biodiversity, ecosystem services at Prescott College, and she lives in Cape Valley, California. Hi, Barbara. Thank you for joining us. We also have Wendy Sue Harper here. She's an educator, soil scientist, and organic farm inspector. She teaches theory and practice in agroecological systems and food system biodiversity conservation in the marketplace at Prescott College, and she lives in Vermont. Hi, Wendy Sue.
Hello.
I'm glad you could join us. We also have Eleanor Tison. She's joining us from Prescott, Arizona, where she's the co-director of the core curriculum at Prescott College and teaches courses in food justice, agroecology, and food preservation. She also has expertise in ethnoecology, seed conservation, and food systems education. Hi, Eleanor. Thank you for joining us. And then we have Lisa Trocchia, who lives in Athens, Ohio, and she's an interdisciplinary food systems scholar. She teaches courses in food systems and eco-nutrition and is the host of the capstone podcast highlighting the final capstone projects of students in the MSFS program at Prescott. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Sharon.
Thanks for joining us.
Sure.
So we're going to have a really lively discussion today on this topic of the local food access during the COVID-19 era. And I'm sure you've seen many concerns in your own bioregion and your communities when it comes to healthy food availability. I know in my region, I'm seeing all sorts of things taking place, from people hovering over the highly processed food sections of the supermarket and just, emptying the shelves and then leaving all of the helpful foods behind. And then in other areas, there are no helpful foods. All over California, we're having some farmers markets that have shut down because they haven't had a good plan in place, while others are still open. So we're just seeing a variety of things. And it all brings up these issues of nutrition consequences, equity, and beyond. So I want to get this started with my first question for the panelists. What are some of the key challenges facing local food production during the COVID-19 era in your specific bioregion?
Well, I'll jump in. So a couple of things come to mind for me, but the obvious one, I guess, is that, it's planting season. So farmers are challenged by trying to anticipate the market. Here, local restaurants represent a huge percentage of the sales for most of our local producers. So with restaurants now, either closed or limited to takeout orders only, it's kind of difficult to know what the market is going to be, how much to plant, basically. So, our farmers market, which is a year-round market, is still open, but even with the COVID-conscious changes to how business is done, frankly, it's not quite as robust as it was. So it's kind of a moving target at this point for farmers. But I think, really, this whole question of challenges, I just want to say, inspired by what I'm seeing here in my bioregion, is that I think the key challenge really is to reframe the narrative away from this tendency to focus on single issues like food production or food access, toward creating opportunities for, systems-based responses in communities. So that's something I hope we can talk a little bit more about, and, maybe we'll find some time to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to look at the whole picture like what you're describing. So does anybody else on our panel have some comments when it comes to what you're seeing in your area?
I could speak a little bit from just locally in Northern California that I know, I'm involved with a food hub within the rural valley where I live. And I know that the farmers here are seeing really strong demand, and some linkages are being made that haven't been made in the past. Actually, the farmers here are now selling to the food banks where they weren't previously, that went through other distribution channels. So that's, there are some real opportunities in making these closer links within a region. But at the same time, I think, it's showing a lot of, we're seeing the weak spots as well. And there's a lot of attention being given to, for farm laborers, a lack of health and safety protections for workers, and inefficiencies in the visa process for migrants in California with a high number of fruit and vegetable farmers. Is a really high labor demand, and that inefficiency and blockages, and the fact that we're making farm workers essential but still illegal has a lot of ironies in it. Mm-hmm. The food banks locally have they're really coming out with statements right now that they had really made a lot of planning for emergencies, but the planning was always for things like a big earthquake or wildfires or natural disasters. And they really had not planned for this really ongoing issue of food supply over the long term. So that's really calling on new resources to think about all of this.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
And I would say also there's been some interesting, just within our little region here, there's been some, California has come out with a statement of really endorsing farmers markets. Yeah. And also in our little region, we have these little pop-up markets with farmers, small growers selling to each other and selling to farm workers. Very small markets, but that's very interesting. And there's been I think, understand in cities, some of the farmers here have been contacted by community buying clubs, which is something that's very popular in Europe, but I think not so much here. People in neighborhoods who are serving as a drop-off point for farmers to deliver products that they then organize their neighbors to pick up. Those are, really interesting phenomenon, I think.
Yes, I live in California too, and it's been really great to see that commitment to keeping the local the farmers markets open and recognizing how important that is. But in Los Angeles last week, I don't know if you noticed in the news, they had to shut down all the Los Angeles farmers markets temporarily until they create a safety plan, because it's such a populated area, and that's an issue. But there is a commitment to getting those open as soon as possible. So does anybody have any other comments in other bioregions when it comes to what you see going on with local food production?
I just wanted to jump in and because some of the things Barbara mentioned are also factors in here in Arizona. I'm based in Prescott, in central highlands of Arizona, but it's also a big, in questions of scale, when you're looking at the larger scale ranchers and farmers, I think labor is the big challenge right now, and especially at this stage in the season. But the governor has declared food production as an essential service, and all the other services that serve food production and distribution. So you are seeing that support, at least, the mandates are coming out. The farmers should be out there and able to get what they need, except maybe not with labor issues. And but what Barbara just mentioned about the buying clubs, the markets here, at least the full year-round market here in Prescott, has not reopened, but they're also, as many around the country, are exploring these other ways or platforms of connecting their consumers. And they've set up a way you can actually pre-order whatever you want from the market, and by Thursdays, and then you go pick it up on Saturday in a parking lot, like a drive-by kind of situation. And they're really working hard to make those connections continue. That many, this is the time when people are ramping up their participation in outdoor markets because the weather's getting nicer. So we're seeing that, but I was interested to also see that the more of those direct relationships, as the demand from households for more of this local food is growing, people just are right out calling farmers directly. Or, even the people that want their backyard chickens, I've been hearing farmers are getting their phones ringing off the hook, and, do you have any hens we can have, or not for eating, but for the eggs. And also some of the entrepreneurs doing local food production of meals, and they're actually getting very entrepreneurial and say, call or text and I'll deliver. So some of these kind of smaller scale, more nimble, whether it's a business or an organization, they're really doing a lot of running around, not very, no efficient systems planning like Lisa's thinking about, but it's sort of spontaneously emerging, almost like a black market. Even the food recovery that has been going on, at least here in Prescott, where you've been trying to have these restaurants who do the takeout, but they have a lot of extra food, and they're trying to juggle and manage those demands. They're donating food still, and these to food recovery organizations that are getting that food back to some of the homeless shelters and other sites where there is still some group feeding going on, and food boxes being prepared, like at the food banks. So it was interesting to see those services are actually kind of having higher need, and maybe even connecting directly with growers, like Barbara mentioned.
That's great. So I wanted to talk about how these local food concerns are impacting nutritional health. This is something that's near and dear to my heart as a registered dietitian, and I'm seeing all sorts of things going on in the community in terms of food access, access to healthy food, all of the children that are missing out on school lunch programs. I'm seeing people cooking for the first time. I'm seeing some positive things. For the first time, literally people cooking the very first meal they've ever cooked at home. So more returning to the pantry, eating more whole foods like whole grains, dried beans, So what are some of the things you're seeing out there when it comes to the nutritional consequences of this issue? Are you seeing anything? Are you seeing any negatives that you're concerned about in terms of local food production, maybe limited in impacting food access?
I'll make one thing that we have that's a positive, and that is our school buses are still running, and they're bringing the school lunches to the kids at home. So they're still getting their food in some places in Vermont. And that's really a very positive innovation.
I was wondering, Wendy Sue, if I could just jump in and off of that. I was curious because something similar is happening here as well, but because of sort of policy decisions have given a waiver to the food service, mechanism with the schools. A lot of those meals are actually being prepared in local restaurants and then being distributed to the school bus service. Are they getting food through cafeterias still at the school? Are the food service folks at the schools preparing and keeping their jobs?
That's my understanding,
Yeah.
that it's still coming from the school.
That's
And
interesting.
the school bus drivers are delivering them to the kids.
What about food banks? There's been so much information about empty shelves and food banks. Are you seeing anything positive in your regions? Any measures there to appeal to getting more stockpiling there?
Well, again, this is sort of that thing that's emerged here, which I was talking about, which is this sort of systems-based response. So, the idea that, I guess it's just like that at this time, you see these networks and social ecosystems becoming visible. And they're pulling together a diverse group of folks that seem to be working on problems together. So, for example, here where, our county, there's 52% of the population lives in poverty here. And not surprisingly, we have the highest food insecurity rate in the state. So clearly, COVID-19 challenges this already vulnerable population nutritionally. Kids are out of school. Some of the school districts here have 80% of their students get free and reduced lunches. So added to that are the food security challenges faced by the elderly who have lost access to their meal sites, or foods with or people that have medical conditions that put them at risk, so they're sheltering in place. There's a growing number of unemployed, as Robin mentioned earlier. So, you add to this the food producers that are losing revenue because of restaurants shutting down, retailers, food workers. So the systems-based thing that's been happening in Athens around, you were talking about the food pantries, is we can feed folks by directly linking the money that's available to the food access initiatives with the local producers, and Barbara mentioned that as well, to make up for some of the losses they've suffered in the restaurant sales and for lack of restaurant sales. And so there's a nonprofit here, Community Food Initiatives, that's doing some great work on this. So the idea is to keep food workers in jobs and local restaurants in business by buying their products and supplying them with local products that they can prepare so that citizens and nonprofit organizations, churches, whoever can purchase these meals and donate them to these distribution sites. There's also another group, Avalanche Pizza here, that actually has an option on their website when you go to order pizza, where for $4 you can order a meal and they will prepare and deliver to kids who are obviously, not in school at the moment and maybe not getting, the only nutritious food of the day that they might be receiving. So, it's inspiring. The food banks are, reworking their ability to be able to directly move in with purchasing from locally sourced places. And I need to get a drink of water. I'm joking.
Yeah, it is inspiring to see people stepping up in unusual ways and being creative, right?
Yeah.
And we're seeing that everywhere, which is very hopeful. So I wanted to move into policy a little bit. Many of the local jurisdictions are on their own to figure out what kind of policies are going to prevent the spread of COVID-19, but also ensure that people have access to healthy food. But what policies are being applied in different regions? So maybe we could talk a little bit about these policies and how they are applied in different regions and how they're impacting local food producers and communities. I think, Barbara, can you highlight your take on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I can give a few thoughts about that. I mean, certainly we're not getting a lot of guidance from the federal government. So the onus is really going further and further down, and a lot of local communities have actually been at the forefront in stepping out with supportive policies. So I think the initiative in California on seeing food banks and farmers markets as being essential services came originally from a lot of activity in Berkeley, and then it has gone, statewide. But it's really interesting to see how a lot of the initiative is coming more from local governments. And I think also within California, there's been some work in local governments in Thousand Oaks, as I understand it, in really looking at price gouging and trying to put measures in place to prevent price gouging, which is an unfortunate possible side effect. And it's really interesting that local governments are trying to figure out what they can do about that.
Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting. I think there's also, just speaking more generally though, and sort of what Lisa talked about, the opportunity that this provides to really think a lot more about our food distribution systems and how brittle they are, and what kind of resilience we might really try to think in the long term, as the food banks are realizing they're there to deal with really one-off emergencies. Maybe now we're looking at something that really goes over the long term, and think about how we have much more, can try to build more resilience into the system and maybe more circular economies. A really good example is given of Brazil and what they had done with the town of Belo Horizonte, supporting local agroecological farmers, generally a very smallholder family farms, to support the urban food hungry, and making those linkages was extremely effective. And that might be some models that we could think out more adopting here.
Mm-hmm. That's a great observation.
I would like to add that I think early on we had great support in our state for farmers on figuring out some of this stuff. And I'm going to put a link in the chat to information for farmers on dealing with COVID-19. And it includes information on what growers should do, cleaning, sanitizing, online ordering platforms farmers can use, farm workers and farm assistants, and more than that. And that stuff came out, I would say, over a month ago, and they've been adding to it. So there has been support by the university to help farmers navigate these rough waters.
Mm-hmm. Very, very great. Good information there.
Yeah, and Sharon, if I can chime in here for just one moment. In the chat, I have shared a resource with you all that we have worked on here at Prescott College through the week. There are so many folks in the food system working to try to gather and track all of these different policies and differential policy implementations across different states. So I've put this Google Doc link in. So if you're scrolling through your chat, it was at 12:30 p.m. Prescott time. So that'll be 3:30 p.m. Eastern time as you scroll up. And please just feel free to highlight the HTTP and pop it into your browser. The Wallace Center, especially, I want to point out the Wallace Center's COVID resources compilation. And I will pop this in here because what the Wallace Center is trying to do is trying to summarize all of these different resources and responses in one place. So I just want to point that out as a resource as you're continuing that conversation. Folks should feel free to click around in that and share it widely and freely and interact directly with those organizations.
Thanks so much, Robin. So I want to kind of segue into really the core of our conversation, and that is why it's so important to be supporting local food production at a time like this. And I think we've learned lessons that have a lot of people have gotten to observe perhaps for the first time. So maybe we could talk a little bit about, what you think are the main takeaways when it comes to the importance of local food productions in scenarios like this.
So I'll start. And in Vermont, we have really spent decades building a strong local food system. And this is situation is certainly going to test it for sure, but we want to keep it strong and grow it even more. And local and fresh food contributes directly to our local economies and also our viewscapes, natural environment through groundwater recharge and wildlife populations and pollinator habitat and everything else. So it's really important for us to have local farms. And the money does stay in the state. It doesn't go out. And I wanted to make a few other comments. And one of them is that we have CSAs in the state, and lots of them, and there are resources where people can find them. But that CSAs also support low-income people through a program called the NOFA Vermont Farm Share Program. And they offer CSA shares for 1/3 of the cost. The farmer kicks in 1/3. And then there's a program that raises money through a one day where everybody eats out and money goes toward the program to help people get fresh and local food. So those are some things for Vermont.
That's great. Are you seeing anything in your areas, other bioregions you'd like to share?
Yeah, well, I think that, I want to echo what Wendy Sue said, obviously, aside from how buying locally helps to keep money localized, strengthening local economies, the simple reason to support community-based food production is really food security. At this point, statistically, over half the fresh fruits and 1/3 of the vegetables that are available at major retailers are imported. So at this point, I don't think anybody knows how a global pandemic will impact food imports. But even domestically, changes, as I think Barbara referred to, in the federal, at the federal level, in terms of how temporary farm worker visas are being handled, they have the potential to significantly disrupt the nation's food supply. So if large-scale growers don't have enough farm workers to plant and harvest crops, that's a problem. So further, there are real problems even currently with migrant farm workers not having adequate protections in place and cases of folks working while sick. So, it makes really good economic sense to support the farmers and food producers in your community, but doing so also helps your community to be more food secure and more resilient. So, get to know the folks in your food community who are food folks, and if you don't already, they have chosen to be community-based for a reason. There are values involved here, and it's an opportunity to develop relationships that can inspire trust that we need at this time.
Yeah, and, I just would jump in and add on to what Lisa's just talking about, that here in Arizona, one of the things that I feel people are starting to do and realize in supporting their local producers is, because the smaller scale producers, they might not even be relying on H2A, but I'm trying to connect some of my now non-resident students to these growers so they can have summer workers. And some of these farms are actually, because we lost, a lot of these young people that went back home to all across the country, they are looking for those kinds of people to be on their farms, and whether they're interning or actually workers. Even the school gardens, I saw there's a question in the chat about community and school gardens, and our episode next week will be focused on that. But the school gardens here, there's no one planting them, and our AmeriCorps Food Corps worker, they had a position all ready to go for the summer called a school garden champion. And I just spoke with a woman who was searching for that person to fill a position. I said, are you still looking for that? They go, yes, because we're going to actually try to get those gardens planted and going. So when the school kids are back, who may end up being back in the summer, who knows? They may have kids coming in earlier. We'll have those gardens ready for education and actually have the food. And one of the questions in the chat was about, isn't community gardening part of food production? And it really is, but I do feel like that, as we'll talk about next week, it's a huge challenge because a lot of people that usually volunteer or use these spaces, even though the coordinators are being denied access to them because some of the institutions or places that have those facilities, like Parks and Recs departments, are having to set policies where they won't let anyone onto these sites. I mean, it's really a kind of conflation of, do you define a community garden as an essential service, and can people set up practices in those gardens where they're keeping themselves safe from COVID-19, but they're able also to kind of do all these therapeutic practices of getting things growing and then benefit from the produce down the line. So the best way to me, I'm seeing around me that people can support their local food producers is get active in connecting the relationships. Like if you know a farmer, connect them to someone that you feel can help them with what they're doing, whether it's driving deliveries or, coming out and working, doing a little weeding, or connecting, young people, that are looking for things to do. And there's ways they can be involved in food production where they're not endangering themselves. So that's kind of where I see our role as food system connectors, is help build these relationships and make them stronger.
Great. Well, that kind of fits into my next question, and that is what people out there can do to support their local farmers. We're talking about how important the local food system is, but, how can people out there just find ways to connect and support? And what are you seeing in your community? What suggestions do you have?
So I'll jump in there. I think that one of the things people can do is to join a CSA now. With the uncertainty of markets, farmers are having confusion about, how they should grow things on their farm. And with people for CSA, it gives them some certainty and helps them plan for.
That's a great suggestion. Anybody else have any comments on that, on ways to support local farmers?
I just wanted to add on to what Wendy Sue was saying and just clarify, most people participating in this webinar probably know that model as community supported agriculture. And basically you're prepaying a grower. And I think this model can work for restaurants. I've seen that this idea of, prepaying, and giving a lump sum out, and that you basically will then benefit down the line. So in farming, it makes sense because you're giving the money ahead for seeds and labor, and then you probably won't be getting any kind of goods out of that until a few months down the line. Well, why not with restaurants? If you have a favorite locally owned restaurant, you could say, why don't we set up a CSA scheme or CSR and get your favorites to all put money in now that they can later redeem through takeout if they're doing takeout. And really being picky about, I tell my neighbors and friends that I'm Zooming with, I'm like, oh, by the way, if you're ordering out or getting food to go, try that local restaurant. They actually are really needing, the big chains and all those are also, advertising a lot, but a lot of our local restaurants don't have the budget to advertise, and it's hard to get the word out that they're open for even takeout and delivery. So I think, supporting and targeting those local entrepreneurs, people doing the food, and then finding farms and growers that might need help with, hey, I want to join your CSA or help you set that up. Some growers in this region aren't as familiar with that. So I feel like wherever you're living, you can introduce that concept. It's a great time to get people doing buying clubs, community supported agriculture, community supported restaurants, a lot of ways where those with means can actually, pay ahead, and you'll all end up with the benefits in a month or two.
That's great. And I also wanted to note that I'm seeing more and more people interested in backyard gardening too, home gardening, which I think is a great, way to practice local food systems. So that's something that, we can all help encourage too. And I'm glad you pointed that out, Eleanor, because a lot of times we're thinking about the local food system as farmers, but the restaurant workers are impacted, local food companies, food entrepreneurs. So how can we support that system? You gave us a few tips, but do you have any other tips for how we could support that part of the local food system?
And I'll just add more, and others may have more to say. I know that here at Prescott College, our undergraduates and I think our graduates in the social justice and community organizing were actually turning their efforts toward this virtually to help advocate for restaurant worker benefits. So they were politically organizing and doing call banks and getting things going to support that. So I personally use my biggest resource, which is students, and get them excited about these things and turn them on to these issues. And they often can help advocate for those who don't have the means or ability to advocate, or support those who are organizations which are trying to advocate for these workers, and in fact, a lot of our students were or have been restaurant workers. So it doubly, you know, fulfills that mission. And I'm actually struggling. I have a couple students that did stay. Some students did stay on our campus. Our campus has not closed, and sent away students that had no other place to go. So we have a core group of about 20, and most of them are doing their courses online, but they're struggling with food security, food access, and the campus has actually started delivering them food boxes every week. And thinking back to your question, Lisa, or excuse me, Sharon, about nutrition, that there are some of them, they have their own kitchens, but some struggled to cook with some of the ingredients that are in these food boxes. So we started a virtual cooking show for them every Tuesday night, and we're going to be actually working with some of the ingredients they've been getting. And that's just a microcosm of, here are students left here on campus. They're not able to kind of socialize and congregate in the same way. They're doing their education online, but they're a little left to themselves, and they're kind of being discouraged from going to the grocery store. So figuring out, then supporting, I feel like I need to support our staff that are trying to make these things work. So I'm not usually a cooking show person, but I'm like, I'll do it, because I figured I can do it. You know, I can show a 20-something how to cook with dried beans. and that's, you know, to me, we all have a role we can play, no matter where we find ourselves in the food system. And I'm so impressed with the different people who are joining the webinar today, because they also, I can see they're key people in their own food systems. You just have to pivot a little and change what you were thinking you're going to be doing in April or May. And maybe now you're doing something a little different that can hopefully be supporting your local economy, your community, and keeping people connected.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I saw
Go
you
ahead,
were
Lisa.
muted, Sharon. Sorry.
Sorry.
No, I appreciate the way you are framing that, Eleanor, because I do think, you know, there's a role for everyone. But when you talk about what consumers can do, I think you have to be honest to say that not everyone can be the kind of consumer that makes a difference at this time. That kind of impact is rooted in a degree of privilege. You know, but that said, for people who can make choices that help local food businesses stay open, that help local farmers stay in the fields, that help folks get distributions of local nutritious food, then they should absolutely assert that privilege. And you know, maybe it's controversial to say this, but Kroger does not need your money as much as the small farmers and food businesses who have committed their time and their resources over the years to providing your community with ethical and sustainably produced food. So if you can support them, you know, you should, by all means. And it does help to float everybody's boat. And if, you know, folks in your communities aren't connecting the dots, you know, be that voice and advocate for working together, using local food resources and assets to feed people in need. You know, our food pantry here is, you know, citizens are encouraging the food pantry to reach out to local farmers and food producers and say, for example, okay, next year, you know, we're going to buy your entire crop of sweet potatoes, or we're going to put in X amount of money toward, you know, a bread delivery every week. So making those kind of partnerships. So you can encourage that sort of thing to be happening as well, if you don't have the money to make the kinds of consumer-based choices that really make a difference. And, you know, that just comes from my bioregion. You know, there's a lot of, you know, folks that live in poverty in this region. So it doesn't mean that you have to spend your way out of it. You can advocate and participate in other ways to make a difference.
Absolutely right. So I think we have time for some questions, Robin. Do we have any questions from our attendees?
Yes, we have lots of questions, and one is a great segue from the comments that were just made. So this question came from Deb Moses, and she's asking, does anyone have any ideas on how low-income people can, quote unquote, invest in farmers when they barely have the cash to pay for groceries today? There's a second part. She says, I'm wondering if there can be supports from government, churches, or a way that SNAP or WIC can be used to pay for subscriptions. So perhaps some of you could comment on ideas on how lower income folks can invest in farmers, or maybe that burden needs to be on others.
I'll start and say that I mentioned already the farm share program, which cuts CSA costs to 1/3, is for low income people in our state. And, it's already in place though, so that if you don't have that in your state, it would be hard to develop it now. But in Vermont, it means that the individual pays 1/3, and then the farmer kicks in 1/3, and then for Vermont raises money to pay for the other 1/3. So that's one way. Another thing is that we have ability in Vermont to accept snaps and other thing at farmers markets. And I've seen posts on the vegetable listserv I'm on suggesting that farmers also do this, set up their farms, and they just have to become a vendor, and then they can accept the snaps for CSA shares and things like that. So that is possible. I don't know how many people have done it, but it's in the realm of possibility.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that one of our producers here, Shagbark Seed and Mill, they've set up a special pricing structure. And so that might be something you can suggest to other producers, but they have a special structure called Good Food for All, so that's below even wholesale prices that they offer for food pantries or distribution sites, churches, schools, that kind of thing. So they've set that up, which is really a neat thing. But I've also been told by local health folks here that, quote unquote, it's never been easier to sign up for WIC, so that dietitians are activating telehealth programs and are working remotely to get people the food education that they need, which is required to get the vouchers. And then again, this whole systems thing, like, gosh, what's the statistic? I can't even remember, but like thousands of Chromebooks have been made available to folks within the school system, by the school system, so that they can access things online. Believe it or not, we live in an area here where, forget about internet. I mean, some places you can't even get cell phone service. So they're setting up hotspots to use with these Chromebooks so that folks can access the telehealth stuff and the things they need for getting subscribed to WIC. And obviously that helps the kids be able to do their online lessons, and it also helps with being able to order food online. A few folks mentioned how that whole thing is happening all over the country as well, where you can pre-order different places and have your food be delivered. So yeah, it's something to think about though, because I mean, it is an issue. It requires, a lot of these things require that you have a credit card, and a lot of people don't have that. So they don't have access to those online solutions. So it's something to think about.
Yeah, and I just wanted to totally agree with all those points and really ask this question of, we've been saying, think of this more as a systems level planning issue, and the fact that we have these inequities becoming more stark, and these, whether it's in terms of information, access to internet, or even access to local healthy food. I see comments coming up about the school lunch programs. I mean, I'm a big advocate of this universal free lunch and figuring out ways where food is more of a right and more of a way that you maintain health in our community. It's thinking of it as a health care issue. So especially in this situation where we're having this pandemic, I feel like if we really need to think about food under almost this, how do we maintain a healthy population, and just getting food to people, forgetting about the money piece, whether you're like some of you were suggesting, more farmers actually going working with food banks and getting massive orders filled. I know in Vermont, they were actually piloting that, sourcing and buying produce from 3 or 4 larger middle scale producers that were growing produce and having that produce actually in the food banks. But you know, kind of a win-win situation where the local or mid-sized growers get a big client, and that client is, you know, the statewide food bank, which then distributes it through all the community food shelves. And hospitals need healthier food. So why aren't we getting more of this food? You know, the farmers actually being able to get those accounts with, you know, the hospitals and institutional food. And why are you even worrying about like these kids that who qualifies for the free food or not? The as we all mentioned with the deliveries and pickups of these foods, why limit it to the kids who just qualify? You know, there's some families that maybe would qualify now, given the fact that the parents have lost their jobs. So at this point, all that paperwork and red tape would be a holdup. The more we think of food as a right and think of ways to get that food to people and thinking of it as you know, a healthcare issue, and take it, but still have the grower, the producer benefiting. I think that's something worth playing with in our head and thinking about. This is one way to solve this scenario, is sort of move it out of the economy and more into this world of community health.
But even within the economy, I think we're really seeing that our distribution channels are not very rational. You know, we have this just-in-time delivery where individual trucks go to individual stores, and among the farmers up here in this valley, there's been individual trucks that go down to farmers markets. They've, you know, tried to band together to have more of an aggregation, but there could be a lot more done along those lines of really rationalizing the logistics system and supporting those people on the distribution channels who are really, they're very vulnerable right now.
Thank you. I think, Barbara, just because you have the last hot mic, there was a question asked privately to me about, could you explain a little bit more what you meant by circular economy and help us understand, you know, what is just help us understand further.
Sure. No, I mean, I think it's a really viable concept right now as we try to rethink how the food system might work. And that involves, for example, I mean, I mentioned previously the example in Brazil of setting up a structure where agroecological farmers are selling their goods to address urban malnutrition. But in between that, there's a whole lot more of local economy, local employment that could be generated through making our supply circles much more circular. So, I mean, just a few examples, I would say, you know, I take examples from where I live. We're trying to address whether we could have more industries around local composting, since composting is not something that each farmer can do easily on their own. Could there be that it's not right now endorsed by the state of California, which supports farmers composting, but not a local industry. But that's an idea of building out, you know, these employment areas, local abattoirs, but also local food hubs and those distribution channels. Should we not be storing more food rather than having it be just-in-time delivery? Should there be more emphasis on food preservation that there used to be a long time ago? So I think there's a real scope for thinking out, building you know, a stronger food system and a stronger local employment at the same time.
Thank you. So I think maybe of the questions that have been asked, the one that's on a similar thread here comes from Emily. And so her question is there any movement to push for even temporary changes specific to COVID-19 to bid rules to allow school districts to source and therefore fund local farms, which would be in line with the circular economy principles? Or is this something that anyone sees as being possible? And Eleanor, you also spoke to this a little bit earlier also.
Yeah, and my understanding is that it's less in some states, and I'm more familiar with the state I used to live in, Vermont, that it's not so much of bid rules as much as the level of insurance that a grower can carry. So it's more about that liability and you know, so if it's a large enough scale farm that carries that insurance, sure, but it's less about the rules and really more about price points. So a lot of the growers that have been involved in farm to school, you know, sometimes they're taking a little bit of a hit and getting a lower price point when they do sell to the schools. If we had some sort of gap closure for them where we're subsidizing that, which a lot of schools have done with things like a farm to school grant, because you want it to benefit the grower ultimately as well. You don't want them to be taking less money than they would get, and in particular, and then the challenges, of course, of the seasonality, with a lot of times what they're growing fresh may not be reaching the kids. It's depending on the time of the year. If it's a root crop, it can be used more extensively. So the complications with sourcing locally for schools is really depends on your bioregion, and there are actually a lot of progressive state laws and policies and funds making this actually happen more and more. And I don't think it's as much about the bid rules as it is about just the way we have set up our school facilities. Like a lot of them don't even have kitchens where you can actually cook whole foods. It's more about heating. And so it's a very complex scenario that if you just remove that one piece, made it easier for that to happen. So from a liability issue viewpoint, I still think you may have other challenges, like who will be processing all this food, particularly in this time of, the need for increased food safety and safety amongst food workers. So if you deliver a box of butternut squash, who's going to be doing all the processing of that and then turning it into whole food for kids? So I think it's a bigger picture question.
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in there because there's been some really innovative stuff done here around that, because public schools are so sourcing locally, but they run into some of those issues that you've talked about. But we have a culinary school whose students need those practical hours chopping vegetables and processing food. And so there are arrangements that have been made between that culinary school and those students to, chop the veggies or steam and minimally process them so they can be delivered to the schools, so that then all they really do need to do is the sort of cut the seal, heat them up and go, but it's still local food produced, by local farmers. So there are some interesting things happening around that, but you're right, it's a very complex issue.
Yeah, thank you. I have a couple quick comments. We're coming up right on the 1 hour mark. So I know that some of you need to log off for your next meeting starting on the hour. We are going to stay and continue with the Q&A session, but I did make a commitment to Rachel Wharton to point out her posting in the chat. She's a food writer working on a story for the New York Times, and she's interested in how community gardens are adapting, planning, both in terms of safety and future food access. Her deadline apparently is before next week's webinar. So of course, I hope that Eleanor and Wendy Sue can be in touch, but for those of you in the audience, please feel free to reach out to her. She placed her email in the chat as a way to reach out to her. But I would like to get back to the Q&A for those of you who need to leave. There was a question from Victoria concerned about, safety and processes and protocols on her, in farming operations. And I want to thank the chat community for really doing an excellent job of providing and sharing resources that various ones of us knew about and had access to. So Wendy Sue Harper shared things that were coming out of Vermont. I shared a couple of those also on the sanitizing and safety. And then Richie, thank you so much for sharing some resources also. So I think we've done what we can, to get you pointed in the right direction there. There was another question earlier that is, it's a specific question about community gardens. And the question is, let me get it in my frame properly here. All right, there we go. So thoughts on community gardens. Our community gardens, they are covered under food production, even though they aren't a business and they don't have workers per se. Seems like exemptions, that are being put in place are based for businesses and not community groups. So this has a little bit of a policy angle in it and also some practical parts of it. But I wonder if anybody had any comments either on the specific or just in general. What do we do with community groups? Are they considered businesses or not? Are they falling under the frameworks of these policy modifications or not?
think it kind of depends on where they are located. And for example, if the community garden was on city parks and recreation managed parks and land, I think they're subject to the policies of that organization. And I think I saw at least one person listening works for a Parks and Rec program as a garden coordinator. And then sometimes they're on more educational spaces, like on a college campus. And I think that some of them they're managed, even on church land. So it kind of, just the way we're not getting much centralized guidance with policy from our federal government. I think you're seeing just a explosion of different ways people are responding to this. In my own part, I'm sort of struggling with our campus gardens because our risk management, staff is like, no student should be out and about, and I'm like, wait, I need them to be in the garden, and we will observe, 6 to 8 feet distance, and we will not have more than 2 or 3 of us in the same space. But, it's from their end of it, they don't want to see any risk. And from my end, I'm like, we need to balance a little risk with the need to get them going, but also the psychological, the mental, physical health aspects of having these young people, that this is their home. And so for them, the community garden here is sort of where they need to be. And so it's a real struggle. I think that that's something that is being faced by community garden coordinators everywhere, whether they have people above them that are telling them what they should or shouldn't do. And you're sort of like caught between wanting to keep everyone healthy and comply with all the regulations, but also your kind of intuitive sense that some of this just needs to happen, and you need to make sure that access is, if people in some community gardens, the plots are actually, people have been on wait lists for these plots. And so how could you let them on and stagger the schedule? I think there's solutions. I think there's ways to keep it safe, but also allow people to start cultivating. And one of the things we'll talk about next week is, that there was even like the fact getting people access to some of these resources. In our area, a lot of the garden seeds have sold out, and people are having difficulty getting access to garden seeds. Even a few seed suppliers, one that we actually had a grant from and have seeds that we're starting here at Prescott College, Native Seed Search. I went on their website yesterday and they said, we have closed our warehouses. We can't send you any seeds. Sorry, well, check back after April 19th or whatever date they had. So even if you wanted to order seeds, some of these more local and interesting seed suppliers, they're not able to send you the seeds. So I think there's like a little bit of, well, how about the materials? What about the tools? What about education around these sites? So I think there's definitely a lot of creativity going on, but within that creativity is also a little bit of pressure to just not do anything.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to chime in here, and I'm going to queue up some of the questions in the Q&A section. So I'm going to direct one of them to Lisa. So Lisa, if you want to direct your eyes to the Q&A section, you're up next. But I just wanted to comment, many of the larger gardening supply companies have actually curtailed or actually paused their retail functions and are only taking orders and processing orders right now from commercial operations. So these are organizations like, I know of Grower Supplies, I know Johnny switched over, and I think High Mowing also. So, this creates some interesting, dilemmas, and I would be very curious to learn more about the decision-making processes of those organizations, and sort of the factors that led to them making those decisions. All have said on their websites that this is temporary. Some have put the blocks through the April 6th, and others a little bit longer. But it is interesting, how that's a major shift in market behavior. So I just wanted to point that out. So I have a couple questions from Lucille, and the questions pertain to really workers and restaurant spaces and kitchen spaces, and how to ensure both support and safety. So her first question is, can the panelists touch upon how emergency food spaces are now producing many meals for under-resourced spaces, and how do they ensure safe handling during these times? So that's the first question, and I'll send that to you, Lisa.
Yeah, and if I can just jump back real quickly to what you were saying, I mean, this is just a good example of why it's good to know who's saving seed in your community. And you know, one thing that we've always done in Athens is have a generous, you know, sort of seed saving community back and forth, and even formal occasions where people do share seeds. So that's still happening and still very important. So you know, that's another thing to point out. But in terms of these emergency food spaces, I think in Athens at least, the food is being prepared by existing restaurants. And we have a community kitchen, and all of these are licensed commercial facilities that have, you know, health and safety protocols that are being followed. So that's where the food's being produced. It's being distributed in, you know, in various places. So I don't know about other places, but it's not, they're not like pop-up, you know, field kitchens, although that would be great. And there are certainly, you know, mutual aid folks who are willing to do that and have been doing that. But at least what's happening on a formal level is being done in certified kitchens.
Thank you. And I'll just add from our first episode of Food Systems Fridays, we had, I believe it was Chef Katie also addressing this particular concern and really reinforcing that the serve safe protocols, you know, pretty much take care of the current guidance. So, you know, as long as the kitchens are maintaining their regular protocols, then that's the assurance. But the situation may be changing rapidly, and I know that there's resources in that compilation list that that we compiled for you. So I would direct your attention there for the, you know, word literally from the horse's mouth there on all of that. There's a final question that I have seen, and it's, are there any comments or stories about how essential workers, so for example, our restaurant workers, our farm workers, are being compensated or not? And the comment associated with it is they're now risking their lives to serve communities.
I would make two comments here. The first is that there are some restaurants that are now doing takeout that haven't before. And cars, you know, you give them your license plate number, you've already paid for your food, you drive up, they see you, they leave the food in a bag on a table, they go in the restaurant and you go pick up your food. And on the menu are like tips that go to the people that are unemployed, and you can buy as many $5 tips as you want. So that's one way to support restaurant workers that are unemployed right now. And then I had one other thing I wanted to say, but it's gone. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
I know there's attention being paid in California, and I'm not sure where it's resolved yet, but really addressing the amount of sick leave that should be allowed for farm workers. And clearly what's normally given is small, and very small at a time like this. So I think it's that at least the issue is out there in the open and being discussed, and hopefully resolved well.
We hope it's resolved well, but I can comment that I've seen in the in all of these different resource compilations that that's currently being discussed in Illinois, Hawaii. It's being discussed in Vermont right now. So this is one of these issues that state by state, because a lot of the labor laws, again, we go back to, are not federal. Some of them are, but some of them are not. And so it'll be important to make sure that we're protecting those who nourish us. I mean, there's not much more important job out there right now.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add as well that because stories were asked for, and I have noticed that I've been very impressed with some of the actually restaurant owners that feel very responsible toward their staff, even if they're not compelled by policy or law to somehow, even though they've had to lay off most of their staff or a lot of their staff, even if they're still just doing takeout, they've come up with their own solutions in some ways, whether it's, again, reaching out to their customer base. I heard one story of where the last days a restaurant was open, a customer came in and left a $2,000 tip to and said for your employees. So, you know, people really rallying around some of these smaller businesses that are the most vulnerable. And you know, I'm hopeful that some of this aid coming may directly benefit those folks. But to me, this is also the silver lining is that we're all talking about this now, and these inequities are being made very obvious, and the fragility of our food system and the fragility of those who most nourish us is being highlighted in a way that always should be. And so this is probably the silver lining, is it's got everyone talking and thinking, and you're seeing it's impacting many people directly in a way that's going to have that ripple effect through a whole economy.
Thank you. I just wanted to share that I do know a number of grocery stores. So, for example, Natural Grocers, their chain is have bumped up the hourly wages by at least 2 hours, or excuse me, $2 per hour. Which, you know, it's a you know, some of us may view that as a gesture, but for others that's meaningful. But it's an acknowledgement, at least, of the additional risk associated with keeping that, you know, essential business open. In terms of all of those who have been made unemployed in the, you know, recent weeks, you know, there are the federal unemployment benefits, and with the support packages that have recently been passed, you know, there are, you know, so we can't a nod towards federal government interventions. You know, there are some protections that are, and some additional support that have been built in to some of those. So it's happening at the individual business side of things, in terms of compensation, and also in terms of, you know, changing the physical functioning of the businesses so that there's reduced exposure for employees. And then there are some of these interventions happening at the state and federal level, you know, extension, you know, making it easier to apply for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistant Program, the SNAP and WIC benefits. And there is a comment coming through from Victoria making the point that the farm workers are in a different category than the restaurant workers. Thank you very much for pointing that out. So I direct all of your attention to Victoria's comment that's in the chat, and she's directing us to some advocacy resources. So really appreciate that. And so with that, I would like to thank all of our panelists for being here today. I really appreciate your time and insights coming from the different corners of the United States. And just a reminder, and I'm going to put one little link in the chat. We did actually have a regularly scheduled, really exciting event this week happen. So we launched a podcast out of Green Mountain College that is really a celebration of food system scholarship called the Capstone. So I would encourage you all to check that out. Lisa Trocchia is the host of the Capstone. So I put the link in there, and please join us at this time next week. So noon Pacific Daylight Time, 3 Eastern Daylight Time, where Eleanor Tison and Wendy Sue Harper, our panelists from today, will be leading a panel discussion about our community and school gardens and the unique challenges that they're facing and opportunities with in the COVID era. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks, Sharon.
Yes, a special thank you to Sharon for facilitation of the panel.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you for joining, all of you. It's a great conversation.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.